Hey, what's up guys, this is Alex from Bevelers Creation to bring you guys this video on how I built this solid walnut desk organizer. Let's get started. I began by laying out and marking all the pieces I'll need for the build. I then cut the lumber down to the rough length on my table saw using my Amana Prestige 40-tooth general purpose blade, which always gives me clean cuts whether I'm doing cross cuts or rib cuts. And unfortunately I don't have a bandsaw, so I also use my table saw to resaw the workpieces to their rough thickness. Even though I'm running a 1.75 horsepower saw, this full curve blade cut through all of that material with no problem. Next, I flattened one face and squared up one edge of the workpieces on my jointer and then finalized their thicknesses on the planer. Then I turned my attention over to making a router template for the organizer tray out of a piece of 1/2" MDF. And for the finishing pass, I used my router with the Amana 1/8 inch radius bowl and tray bit with an upper ball bearing that will ride along the template. This bit will leave the bottom of the pockets nice and flat while producing a tight radius in the corners. Next, I cut the tray to its final size and then laid out an angled cut on the top surface of the tray going from 1 inch in the back down to 1/4 inch in the front. To make the cut, I'm using my tenon jig to help to hold my workpiece while keeping my fingers away from the blade. And I completed the cut by swapping the workpiece to the other side of the blade. Next, I made the bottom support for the top tray for holding the tray we just made as well as the stationary dividers later. I snuck up on the cut with my Dado blades until the tray could sit snug inside, at which point I glued them together. After the glue has dried, I came out the next day to cut the tray assembly down to size, followed by cutting 2 notches in the corners for hiding the stop dados later. Next, I began to cut the 1/4 inch pieces that will make up for the stationary dividers behind the tray, starting with the pencil holder. I used the Amana Spektra coated 1/4 inch downcut bit on my router table to cut dados into the pencil holder sides to accept dividers used to separate it into 2 compartments. Here I'm using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit to drill some holes in the workpiece that will eventually sit in the horizontal dado cut earlier. And then finally gluing all the pieces for the pencil holder together and then glued that to the tray assembly, holding everything together with some tape and light clamping pressure. While the glue dried for the pencil holder, I laid out and cut the larger dividers that will sit in the back, which are once again attached to the tray assembly using glue and clamps. With the tray assembly completed, I began to work on the case. I started with the side panels, which I cut to size on the table saw. And then I set up the Amana Spektra coated 1/2 inch 3-flute downcut bit in my router table to cut the stop dados into the side panels for attaching all the horizontal panels later. On the first panel, I pressed one end against the stop block and then slowly set the workpiece down onto the bit, and using a push block to push the piece forward to complete the stop dado. Without moving the fence, I routed the stop dado into the panel on the opposite side by simply running the workpiece through until it hit the stop block. And then I just repeated these steps for the rest of the dados in the side panels. With the bit still set up in the router table, I cut a rabbet in the back of each panel for accepting a back panel later on. Here I'm doing a quick dry fit to help determine the size of the horizontal and vertical partitions, which I cut at the table saw. Off camera, I routed stop dados to fit the rest of the partitions, just as I did before, and then I did another dry assembly in order to lay out the hinges, which is what I'm doing here. To cut the mortises for the hinges, I set up a guide bushing in my router along with the Amana Spektra coated 1/4 inch downcut bit. With the help of a template, I made the cuts in both the bottom panel and the bottom face of the organizer tray. Before cutting mortises in the door panel, I'm going to use some sliding dovetail battens to ensure that the door will stay flat over time. First, I made some curve cuts at the table saw to help reduce the load on the dovetail bit later. To cut the dovetail grooves, I set up the Amana tool Carbide tipped 14-degree dovetail bit at my router table, and then proceeded with the cuts in the door panel. To make the dovetail battens, I ran a workpiece through vertically as shown without changing the height of the bit. And then I cut the dovetail portion off of the workpiece at the table saw and then made a cross cut to produce the 2 battens I needed for the door. These dovetail battens are friction fitted into the dovetail grooves in the door, so there's really no need to apply any glue. After flushing everything up with some hand tools, I cut the mortises for the female side of the knife hinges on the top and bottom edges of the door. And after installing the hinge and checking the fit for the door, I laid out the holes for the ball catch used for holding the door closed, which I drilled out at the drill press. I did another dry assembly to lay out and cut the final profile of the side panels. With all the pieces for the case complete, I sanded everything up to 220 grit before gluing the case together. I started by gluing up the bottom panel and the top tray to the two side panels, and then slid the partitions into their respective dados. Some pieces swelled up after the glue was applied, but a little gentle tapping with a mallet moved things right along. The next day, I began to make the hardwood drawers. I first ripped all the pieces down to width, and then finally cross-cutting them to their final lengths. At the router table, I set up the Amana Spektra coated 1/4 inch downcut bit to cut dados into the drawer pieces for accepting drawer bottoms later. Next, I cut rabbets on the drawer fronts and backs, which is how the drawer sides will attach, as you see here. With the drawers set aside, I worked on the 3/8 inch thick drawer bottoms, with rabbets cut around 3 sides that left about 1/4 inch material to go inside the dados of the drawers. Before calling it done, I cut 2 notches along the back edge of the drawer bottoms, which will allow screws to hold the drawer bottoms to the drawer back panels. And here you see how all of that come together. The screws will hold the drawer bottoms securely to the back, while the slits will still allow for wood movement. Finally, I applied finish to all the drawers in the case off camera and attached all the brass hardware, including the drawer and door pulls. The next day, I began to work on the back panel. I set my router table up with the Amana Spektra coated 1/2 inch downcut bit in order to cut the rabbets for the shiplap joint. And using some offcuts as spacers, I kept a 1/8 inch gap between the panels, then attached them to the case using only a few brat nails to finish the assembly. And with that, the project is complete. I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and it may seem like a small project, but there were actually a lot of challenges during both the design and the build process. The biggest one I'd say was probably the top tray assembly. I wanted the design of the top to fit all the things I always reach for on a daily basis while staying true to my own build style. And if you follow me for a while, you'd know I add angles to just about everything I make. In the end, I think I was able to achieve that. And once again, this is Alex from Bevelich Creations, and I hope this build has inspired you to make one for yourself, or at least learn something new to help you in your future builds. And thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.